Welcome back, everyone, to the eCoreAcademy e-learning platform. My name is AJay Raj, back with yet another eCore Express Java lesson for you all. And this lesson topic is going to be on do-while loops. We're going to be continuing on our Unit 4, which is all on the loops. We covered previously the for loop and the while loop. Now we're going to be going into our third loop, which is our do-while loop. We're going to take a look at do-while loops and understand their structure and function, see how they're different or similar to the previous loops that we covered. So I'm going to switch over to my Eclipse workspace so we can see our notes and do some real-time practice. All right, as you can see here on my screen, I have the notes set up for this lesson on do-while loops. This is going to be created on the same class that we've been using so far for this unit 4 on loops. So we had our for loop notes and our while loop notes created on the same class under our unit 4 loop section. But we're just going to add on to our do-while loops. We're just going to add this on to the very bottom of that initial class that we created. So just go ahead and put these notes in at the same class, but just put it in right below and create a header. I suggest you copy the same note format that I have. It saves some space and also saves time. All right, so like I said, we're going to be diving into do-while loops, but one thing that we do have the advantage of is we've already covered what loops are. We know that loops are any sort of block of code that allows you to repeat any repetitive statements within your lines of code. So say, for example, you wanted to execute a certain line of code. You wanted to execute it 10 times. Rather than manually typing it out 10 times on your actual Java sheet, you can put it within a loop, and that'll repeat it for the amount of times that you want. So it just saves you a lot of time. So a do-while loop is another variation. The for loop and a while loop are more common, but the do-while loop is very similar to what is known as the while loop. In our previous lesson, we covered it, but it's constructed in different fragments. It has another part to it that's called the do part, and then the while part, which is our conditionals, is separate. It's put in a different spot. It looks very similar, but it's constructed slightly differently and it has a different purpose as well. The only difference is that do-while loops allow for the loop to be executed first and then checks the conditional after every repetition. Although the do-while loop looks very similar to the while loop, it's a little bit different in its structure. It has the do part, I call it. Essentially, it's in the name. I'll explain what that part of the do-while loop is. But also, unlike the while loop will always check the conditional, meaning it'll check if the number of repetitions is already met, if that threshold number is met, and if the loop is going to stop executing. So it'll check that first and then go into the code to see if you're valid to keep continuing. However, the do-while loop is a little bit different. For the very first time that the loop runs, it'll run through the sequence of code that you want inside of that loop, and then it'll check if the number of repetitions is okay to continue. If it isn't, it'll exit. So what happens is, even if the conditional at the bottom, even if after the first time you say you want to run the loop, even after the first time the conditional does not work, it'll still run one minimum time for any conditional that you set. Even though those repetitions aren't part of the conditional, it'll exit it afterwards. Unlike the while loop and the for loop, it will run at least once. So I'll show you what that looks like with an example just to explain that a little bit more. But that's the only difference. It's very similar to our while loops. So while loops are the opposite. Like I said, they have the conditional first. So no matter what the counter is set to do, the do while loop will always run a minimum of once. And that's obviously a preference in a program. I'm not sure that that's always necessary in all programs that you're going to be utilizing. Most of the time, you would want to have a better hold on how many times your loop runs. So I'd kind of recommend against the do while loop for now. You can do more and you can control your loop a little bit better with the while loop and the for loop. So this is not true for while loops, as they will sometimes not run at all if the counter already doesn't meet the conditional. Like I said, that's just better control over how many times you want the loop to run. It won't run like one default time. So yeah. So now let's move on to an example. Let's take a look at what the structure of the do while loop looks like in terms of a graph. In terms of just an example, a sketched out example. So as you can see here at the very top of the code, we're going to create an integer called counter, just like our while loop. This is just an external counter because it's not built into the do while loop. And then within the do while loop, within those small squiggly braces here, that's where you're going to be putting your actual code. So you're going to type in do, and then you're going to put in whatever code you wanted the program to actually repeat. Then obviously you'd be updating your counter. And then once you at the very bottom next to the closing bracket, you would use your conditional. Like that's a little bit different from our while loop, Normally the while loop would, obviously start with your while loop conditional and then go into the loop. But this is different. It says do here because it executes the code, and then after every repetition, it'll use the while part of the statement to actually check the conditional and see if it should run again. All right, so let's take a look at the three different parts of the do while loop. Just to break it down like we did in the previous lesson, this should be a little bit easier to grasp. So the external counter is the first part. This is very similar to that in which you created as in the our while loops. When you create a while loop, it's the same concept. It's the exact same concept. So you'd just be creating an external integer here called counter, or you can name it whatever you want, something with significance, and that would just count how many repetitions you want, how many repetitions total you have. So you would just create that integer on the outside of your loop. You'd oftentimes set it to 0, and that's outside of the do while loop. And then within the do while loop, you'd obviously do your update. So that's here. This is this is going to be part of your update here, um, within the do while loop. The counter plus plus, counter minus minus. That's where you're going to update the counter, however, by however much you would like, and that's just essentially tracking how many repetitions you've gone through with the do while loop. So those are exactly the same with the while loop. Now, what's different are these next two parts. So the second part is the essentially the do part. It's the only difference in the name, and it's the only major difference in the actual do while loop structure. So the do part is the part of the loop that signals the exact sequences of code that will be repeated. And also the counter is included at the bottom of the section, which can be updated. Like I said, the counter is located within the actual loop, just like the while loop, so that's not different. But the only difference is this do part here, this do section here. All that's saying is you're going to execute the code first, and then at the very bottom, you're going to you're going to do your official while statement, and that's going to check whether or not you want the loop to repeat again. That's your conditionals. You're going to set that less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to a certain number. And that's going to be based off of what your counter value is, like your counter variable value is. So the while part over here is the same thing that you would see in a while loop. It's a conditional that checks for the right conditions after each repetition of the do while loop. Here you'll check if the counter is valid or no longer adhering to your conditional statement. So the common conditionals, like I said, less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. So say, for example, if you wanted your do while loop to run 4 times, it would check if the counter is less than 4. So once it reaches that, and every time you go through the do while loop, that counter plus plus is going to increase it by 1. You'd update it just as an example, and then once you reach 4, it'll essentially stop the do while loop from running again. So that's basically what your conditional does. It's essentially setting an upper limit to how many repetitions you want for the loop to run. And also you can do a lower limit. You can decrease it by 1, but for more common examples, we always just increase the counter by 1, just so we know how many repetitions we went through. All right, so now let's take a look at a practice. Let's take a look at a real-time example of forming a do-while loop and keeping an objective in mind, a simple objective. So we're going to do the same thing that we've done with our previous loops. We're going to do system.out.println statements. We're going to print one statement to our console. We want to print it out a total of 10 times. And then I'm going to be showing you what's a little bit different with the do-while loop, how it automatically default prints out one statement no matter what your conditional is. So let's create our statement here, our loop here, our do-while loop. The first thing that we have to do is create a counter. That counter is just going to count how many repetitions we have. So we're going to call this int counter. And we declared our integer counter here, but because it's local, because it's only for the loop, we're not going to use it in like an entire program. We can assign it the same value. We can assign it a value on the same exact line that we declared it. So we're going to set our counter equal to 0. Oftentimes you set it equal to 0. That way you can count how many repetitions you have after each update. So then after this, we're going to hit enter. And now we're going to create our do while loop. Now the first thing you do is going to type in those 2 letters, do, and then you're going to open up your brackets. So you have a set of brackets here. Now within this set of brackets, remember there's 2 things we have to do. One of those things is going to be the actual lines of code that we want to print out, or that we want to execute, and we want them to repeat. So that's going to be system.out.println, just as an example of a line of code that we would use. Let's say hello world again. And then we'll end that with a semicolon. And then right below that, obviously, this the last part of this, within the actual do part, we have to update the variable counter. So every time this repeats, it'll update the variable counter. It'll increase it by 1 to see how many repetitions we've gone through in the loop. So we'll say counter plus plus. That's going to increase it by 1 every time the do while loop runs. And now for the very last part, we have to create our while statement. This is going to be our conditional. So we'll say while and then parentheses here. So then in parentheses, we're going to say essentially what we want. So in this case, if we want to run this loop for a certain amount of repetitions, then we would use our counter statement here, our counter variable here, which is essentially counting how many repetitions we've gone through. And we're going to set those repetitions less than 10. So once it hits 10, the do while loop will stop running. And we're supposed to see a total of 10 statements printed out to our console window. And we have to end this with a semicolon, this statement here. So let's see if that works. Let's print this out to our console. Let's hit the play button and see. All right, so as you can see down here in my console window, we have hello world printed out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 total times. So this do while loop is fully functional. It's very similar to the while loop. Now I'm going to be showing you the difference between the while loop and the do while loop here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my counter. I'm going to leave it at the same value. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say if counter is less than 0. I'll just change my counter less than 0. I'm going to change my conditional totally. Now, if you think about this, if the do while loop were to run, and if my initial value, my initial counter variable is set equal to 0, right, we're going to run the code, and it's going to say counter plus plus once we go into our do while loop right here. So what's going to happen is it's going to execute this line of code. It's going to print it out automatically. That's the first thing it'll do. Then it'll update the value counter. So the counter will actually be equal to 1. Once you put in 0 here, it'll increase it by 1 within the do while loop, and it'll be equal to 1. Then it's going to come out of this do part, and it's going to go to the while part where it's going to check the conditional. Now we know that the value one is stored in the variable counter, and when we set number 1 counter, we're going to plug in our value 1. We're going to substitute it for counter. If we put in 1 here for counter, we know that 1 is not less than 0. So technically, this whole loop shouldn't have even run. Our starting value wouldn't have even worked out with the conditional. However, unlike the while loop that's going to check that first, and it'll automatically say, no, we cannot process this starting value, so you're not going to have any repetitions of this loop. The do while loop will run once, then check that the counter doesn't even make sense, and then it'll stop running. So it'll only run once, unlike the while loop, which won't run at all in the same example. So if we hit play, as you can see here, it did actually print out once, but then it realized the counter is invalid and stopped. So that's one of the bugs about do while loops. Sometimes you might want it in a program, not very common. So I would recommend staying against do while loops if you're a beginner, but there are more advanced codes where that is actually necessary. But we'll get into that in our later parts of this course. All right, everyone. So that'll be it for today's lesson. I hope you all enjoyed. Please make sure to like and subscribe down below and leave a comment as well to help support the channel. Check out our website and email us if you have any questions. Also, make sure to check all of our socials in the description box linked down below. All right, everyone. This has been AJay Raj, and I will see you all in the next video.